You stopped carrying them. That is the part you can name. What you cannot name is what arrived in the place where the carrying used to live. It is not relief. You expected relief. You were told by everyone who writes about this that what comes after the leaving is freedom. They lied, or rather, they spoke from a place they had not yet inhabited. What comes after you stop carrying everyone is not freedom. It is a silence so complete that you mistake it. At first, for failure, you recognize this. The loneliness has a name, and the name is older than your healing. The mistake most people make at this stage is to look backward. They assume the silence means the work was wrong, that the leaving was premature, that the people they stopped carrying must have been carrying something for them too. And now that something is gone, and now they are bereft. This is the first lie the void tells. It tells it persuasively because the void speaks in your own voice. I want you to understand something before we go further. What you are inside right now is not depression. It resembles depression. The fatigue is similar. The flatness is similar. The strange disinterest in things that once organized your days, that too is similar. But it is not the same thing. Depression is a pathology. What you are in is a phase. Jung, in the second of his 2 essays on analytical psychology, called it the interregnum, the time between governments, when the old authority has been deposed and the new authority has not yet taken its seat. He used the word deliberately. He knew what he was naming. The old self has been deposed. You did that. You stopped answering the phone calls that drained you. You stopped explaining yourself to people who had decided, long before you spoke, that you would be the one to bend. You stopped being the emotional infrastructure of rooms you did not build. That self, the carrier, the holder, the one whose nervous system was the family weather, has been removed from office quietly, without ceremony. There was no last day. You only noticed, weeks later, that the carrying had stopped. What no one tells you is that the new self does not arrive in the same moment. There is a gap. The gap is the whole subject of this lecture. I will return to this in a moment. First, the room. There is a particular feeling in the body when you enter a house you used to live in but no longer do. You know the layout. Your hand still reaches for the light switch in the right place. The smell is still partly yours, but the rooms have been emptied not by anyone else, by time itself. And now the space that was once dense with your life is just a shape. That is what your interior feels like now. The architecture is intact. The furniture is gone. You walk through your own days and the rooms echo. This is not a metaphor. This is the precise phenomenology of the post-individuation void, and Jung was clear about it. When the persona drops and the carrying self is a persona, a very thick one, often built before you had language, there is a period in which the ego cannot find itself in the old reflections. The mirrors that used to work do not work. The people who used to call up the familiar response are no longer calling up that response. You walk past the mirror in the hall, and the woman in it looks like someone you knew a long time ago. Most people, faced with this panic, they reach back. They call someone they had stopped carrying and offer to carry them again, just for an evening, just to feel like themselves. And it works, briefly, The old self animates, the room fills with the familiar weather, and then, an hour later or a day later, the silence returns, deeper than before. Because now it is contaminated by the brief regression. Do not do this. Or rather, if you have already done this, do not be ashamed of it. The reaching back is part of the phase. It is the psyche testing whether the old structure is truly gone or merely sleeping. What you learn when you do it is that it is gone. The animation was performance. The weather was rehearsed. You can still do it. You will simply find afterward that you no longer live there. There is a passage in the Tavistock lectures where Jung speaks about the way the unconscious withdraws its projections from the people we have used to know ourselves. He does not say it kindly. He observed that the withdrawal is experienced by the ego as a kind of bereavement, even when no one has died and no one has left. The bereavement is for the version of yourself that existed only in their gaze. When you stop carrying someone, you also stop being the one they could see. Both selves end. The grief you feel is not entirely for them. It is for the you that was visible inside the carrying. This is the part the healing books do not write about. They cannot. To write about it would be to admit that the freedom they promised was not the whole story, that what comes after the leaving is, for a time, not arrival but suspension, that you will stand in your own life like a visitor for longer than anyone warned you. There is a Latin word for this state, used by the alchemists. Jung studied so carefully in his later years. They called it the nigredo, the blackening. It is not exactly your situation, because the nigredo is the active dissolution, the burning down. What you are in is what comes immediately after the cooled ash, the dark water, the period when the fire has done its work and the next stage has not begun. The alchemists, who were not sentimental men, called this period necessary. They did not say it was pleasant. They said it could not be skipped. Anyone who tried to skip it produced a false gold, which is to say, a self that looked whole but rang hollow when struck. You are not producing false gold. You are letting the ash settle. That is the entire work of this phase, and it cannot be hurried. I want to say something now that may sound strange, but I will say it precisely. The loneliness you feel right now is not a sign that you made the wrong choice. It is a sign that you made the right one deeply enough that the old structure cannot reconstitute itself to comfort you. If the carrying had been a lighter thing, a habit, a preference, a learned behavior, its absence would not feel like this. The fact that the absence feels like the floor has fallen out is the evidence that what you stopped doing was not a behavior. It was the structure of your selfhood. The ego that was built on it has nowhere currently to stand. It will find ground again, but not in the place it stood before, and not on the schedule you would prefer. There is something else I want to name, and then I will let this part rest. The people you stopped carrying have not, in most cases, understood what has happened. They experience your withdrawal as cruelty, or as illness, or as a phase they expect you to come out of. They are waiting for the old you to return. Some of them are kind about the waiting. Some of them are not. Either way, their waiting is a pressure you can feel without being told it is there. The pressure is real, and the pressure is also not your problem. Their grief for the version of you they could use is a grief they will have to do without your participation. You cannot carry their grief about the fact that you stopped carrying them. That recursion would consume you entirely. The silence around you right now contains their waiting. It contains your own bereavement for the visible self that lived inside their gaze. It contains the ash of a structure that took decades to build, and underneath all of that, faint at first, almost inaudible, it contains something else, something that has not yet spoken, because what is forming in you cannot speak in the old language. That is what this lecture is about. The thing that has not yet spoken, the self that is forming in the silence, slowly, without your supervision, in a phase that has a name Jung gave it, and that almost no one in the popular literature has the patience to describe. You did not fail. You did not leave too soon. You did not stop carrying everyone in error. What you did was complete a movement that the popular framework does not have a stage for. The framework ends at you left. Jung's framework continues from there into the part you are inside now. That continuation is what we will walk through together. Before I take you further into the phase itself, I have to clear something away. There is a confusion that almost everyone in this stage carries, and if it is not named early, it will distort the rest of what you hear. The confusion is this: you have been told by therapists, by books, by friends who mean well, that what you are feeling is grief from leaving. That phrase is not wrong. Exactly. It is just too small. It treats your state as the aftermath of a transaction. You ended a relationship. You ended several relationships. And now you are mourning, as if the work were to feel the feelings, process the loss, and return to a recognizable life. That is not what is happening to you. What is happening to you is structural, not transactional. You have not lost a set of people. You have lost the version of yourself that those people called into existence. Those are different losses. The first is grief. The second has no English word that I trust, which is why Jung went back to Latin, and the alchemists, and the dream material of his patients. To describe it, he needed a vocabulary that had not been worn smooth by self-help. The reason this distinction matters is that grief, properly mourned, ends. The structural loss does not end in the same way. It does not resolve into acceptance. It resolves into the slow formation of a different self, which is not the same process and does not operate on the same timeline. If you treat this phase as grief, you will keep waiting for the feeling of resolution to come. It will not come, not because you are doing something wrong, because resolution is the wrong category. What you are inside is closer to gestation. Something is being formed very slowly, in conditions that require darkness and stillness. The discomfort you feel is not the discomfort of healing. It is the discomfort of a structure that has not yet finished assembling itself. You cannot rush this. You also cannot, properly speaking, participate in it. The forming is happening below the level at which your conscious will can reach. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, and I am paraphrasing, because I want you to hear the substance, not perform a citation. that the ego must learn to wait on the self. The self is not your conscious identity. It is the larger organizing center of the psyche, what he called the imago Dei in the individual. It moves on its own schedule. When the old ego structure has been dismantled and you, by stopping the carrying, have dismantled yours, the self is what forms the new arrangement. But the self does not consult the calendar. It does not respond to your wish for it to hurry. It works in the way that a forest works after a fire, which is to say, in seasons that have nothing to do with your impatience. I want to give you a dream now. I treated a woman once. In the middle period of my work, she was in her late 40s. She had recently completed what she called the leaving year, meaning 12 months in which she had systematically ended her role as the emotional center of an extended family, and she came to me with a dream she had repeated in slightly varied forms 3 times in a single week. She dreamed she was walking through her childhood home, not the home she lived in as an adult, the older one, the one she had not seen in decades. The rooms were, as she remembered them in their layout, the wallpaper, the position of the windows, the smell of the wood in the hall, but all of the furniture was gone, not stolen, not moved, simply absent, as if the house had been emptied with great care by someone who knew exactly where each piece belonged and had decided that none of it was needed anymore. She walked from room to room. In each room, she looked for something she did not know what, and in each room, she did not find it. In the last room, the small one at the back of the house, where her mother used to keep the sewing things, she stopped. The window was open. The light coming through it was the color of late afternoon in autumn. She stood in the empty room and felt in the dream that she had been waiting her entire life to be alone in this room and only now had understood it. Then she woke up. I want you to stay with that dream for a moment, because almost everything about your current state is inside it. The house is the structure of her former selfhood, built in childhood, occupied through adulthood, intact in its architecture but empty now of the things she had used to furnish her identity. The furniture is gone. Notice that she does not grieve the furniture. She walks through the rooms, she looks, and in the last room, the small one, the one her mother used, she stops. The window is open. The light is autumn light, which Jung associated throughout his work with the phase of the psyche that is past its summer and approaching its longer interior. She is alone. The aloneness is not a deprivation. It is, in the dream, the thing she had been waiting for without knowing it. That dream described her phase precisely. The selfhood she had built in order to be useful to her family was gone. The architecture of who she had been remained. She still had her body, her name, her history, but the contents of that selfhood, the constant inhabitation of it by other people's needs, had been removed. And what she found in the smallest and most overlooked room of the structure was that the emptiness was not punishment. It was the condition under which something else could finally be heard. I will tell you what I told her, because it is what I want to tell you. The dream was not asking her to do anything. It was naming where she was She had reached the small back room. She had stopped looking. The light was already there. This is the part of the phase that the popular framework cannot describe. Because the popular framework is committed to the language of arrival, it wants to tell you that you have healed, that you are now free, that the next chapter is beginning. The dream does not speak in those terms. The dream says you are in an empty house, and the light is real, and the waiting was the point. Now I want to name something specific that may be happening in your body, because Jung was always clear that the psyche is not separate from the somatic, and this phase has a body to it that almost no one will warn you about. You may be sleeping more than usual, or less. You may be experiencing a flatness of appetite, not because you are unwell, but because the body, when it is in this kind of restructuring, withdraws energy from peripheral functions in order to perform the deeper work. You may find that activities which used to feel pleasurable now feel only neutral, not unpleasant, not effortful, simply neutral. You may notice that you do not particularly want to see people, even people you love, and that when you do see them, you return home tired in a way that is disproportionate to the visit. None of this is pathology. All of this is the body managing the energy cost of the structural reformation happening inside it. If you go to a doctor in this phase and describe the symptoms, you will likely be offered a diagnosis. The diagnosis will be partly correct in the sense that the symptoms are real and your suffering is real. The diagnosis will also be incomplete because the framework of pathology cannot see the phase you are in as anything other than disorder. There is no diagnostic code for nigredo, aftermath. There is no clinical category for interregnum of the self. Modern medicine, in its current configuration, can describe the symptom and miss the meaning entirely. I am not telling you to avoid medical care if you need it. I am telling you to know what you are inside, regardless of what name a clinician offers you for it. Jung was emphatic on this point throughout his career. He observed, in case after case, that patients who were treated only at the symptomatic level, given medication, given behavioral interventions, given the standard tools, often improved in their functioning but failed to complete the phase. They returned to capacity. They did not return to themselves. The phase, when interrupted, simply postponed itself. It would surface again years later, often in a different form, often more severely, because the structural work it was attempting had not been allowed to complete. You have stopped carrying everyone. That act by itself has placed you in the phase. The phase will do its work whether you understand it or not. What understanding offers is not relief, but orientation. You will still feel the emptiness. You will still walk through your interior rooms and find them unfurnished, but you will know where you are. You will not mistake the phase for failure. You will not reach back into the old structure in order to feel briefly recognizable to yourself. You will, instead, learn to stay in the small back room with the window open, with the autumn light, and wait for what is forming to form. There is one more thing I need to say before this part closes. The waiting is not passive. This is the misunderstanding most people bring to the phase. They hear, wait, and think, do nothing. That is not what the phase asks. The phase asks for a very specific kind of attention. It asks you to remain present to your interior without demanding that it produce anything. It asks you to notice the silence without filling it. It asks you to inhabit the empty rooms without redecorating them out of anxiety. This is harder than it sounds. The ego is built to act. The ego, faced with structural absence, will generate any kind of activity in order to feel functional projects, relationships, geographic moves, new identities, and most of that activity will be premature. It will be the false gold the alchemists warned about, a self assembled out of impatience, polished on the outside, hollow at the core. The patience this phase requires is not the patience of waiting for something pleasant to arrive. It is the patience of letting a structure form that you cannot supervise. You will not see it forming. You will not feel it forming. You will feel, mostly, the absence of the old structure, and you will be tempted repeatedly to mistake that absence for evidence that nothing is happening. Something is happening. It is happening below the floor of your awareness, in the part of the psyche that does not report to you on its progress. Your work is to not interfere with it. The people who have completed this phase, and there are some, though they rarely write books about it, because the phase teaches a certain reluctance to perform one's interior, describe it afterward in similar terms. They say that the new self, when it came, did not announce itself. It simply began to be present in small decisions, the way they answered a question, the way they did not answer one, the way they walked into a room and did not adjust themselves to its emotional weather. They did not feel newly whole. They felt, instead, that something which had been forming in the dark had become quiet enough and grounded enough to begin to operate without their needing to verify it. That is what is forming in you now. That is what the empty rooms are making space for. That is what the silence, which still feels like loss, will eventually be revealed to have been holding. The carrying has ended. What you are inside now is the room in which the next self is being assembled by hands that are not yours. I want to take you now into a region of this phase that is rarely spoken about, because it is uncomfortable to name and almost impossible to name in the language of healing. The popular framework wants to treat what you are inside as a kind of cocoon, a private, gentle, generative interior in which transformation occurs and from which a more authentic self will eventually emerge. That image is sentimental. It is also incorrect. The interior you are inside is not a cocoon. It is closer to what Jung, following the alchemists, called the vase, the vessel, and the vessel, in alchemical work, is a sealed container in which substances combine under pressure and heat. The vessel does not protect what is inside it. The vessel contains what is inside it, so that the work can proceed without dispersing. You are inside the vessel. The sealing is what creates the loneliness. The pressure is what creates the disorientation. The combining is what creates the strangeness in your own reflection. None of this is gentle. The popular framework gets the gentleness wrong because it confuses the outcome with the process. The outcome, if you do not interfere has a certain stillness to it. The process is severe. I want to name 3 specific severities, because if you do not have names for them, you will treat them as evidence of failure rather than as features of the phase. The first severity is the loss of the future you had been planning. Not the literal future. The calendar still operates. The bills still arrive. The small commitments still need keeping. What is gone is the imagined future, the version of your life you had been quietly composing year after year, in which a particular kind of self would eventually arrive at a particular kind of destination. That self has been deposed along with the carrying self because the imagined future was the imagined future of that self. It belonged to the structure that no longer exists. And now, when you try to think about what you want, what you are working toward, what the next 5 years might look like, the answer comes back blank. Not sad blank, not despairing blank, just blank. In the way a page is blank, not the absence of writing, but the absence of the writer. Most people, encountering this panic, they try to generate a new future immediately. They make lists, they imagine new careers, new homes, new partners, new versions of themselves they could become. The lists feel productive while they are being written. They feel hollow within a week. This is because the lists are being produced by an ego that no longer has the structural authority to commit to anything. You are writing futures for a self that has not yet formed. The futures cannot stick to anything because there is nothing yet to stick them to. The phase asks you to tolerate the blank page, not to fill it, not to decide prematurely what you are now for. Jung observed in his work with patients in this phase that the futures which eventually formed had a quality the patient could not have predicted in advance. They did not look like improved versions of the old futures. They looked like something the patient, before the phase, would not have recognized as a future at all. A different shape, a different scale, often a smaller scale in the conventional sense, but with a density the old futures had lacked. The blank page, properly tolerated, eventually wrote itself in a hand the patient came to recognize as their own, but only after the writing had begun. The second severity is the disturbance of memory. You may have noticed already that your memory of your own past has begun to feel strange, not unreliable in the sense of forgetting the events are still there. The strangeness is interpretive, the story you used to tell about your own life, the through line, the narrative that explained how you came to be who you are, no longer feels quite right. It is not wrong. Exactly, the events still happened, but the meaning you had assigned to them, the framework that held them together as the story of your life, that framework has loosened. The events are now floating slightly. They do not yet belong to a new story. They have ceased to belong to the old one. This is uncomfortable in a way the popular framework cannot describe, because the popular framework treats memory as data. It assumes that your past is what it was, and that healing is about coming to terms with it. What Jung understood and what this phase will teach you whether you want to be taught or not, is that the past is not data. The past is a structure that the present self maintains in order to be continuous with itself. When the present self is being restructured, the past restructures with it, not the events, the meaning of the events. The same childhood can be the story of a wound, the story of a survival, the story of a vocation, the story of a misunderstanding, depending on the self that is currently telling it. When the teller changes, the story changes. There is no fixed past underneath, waiting to be discovered. There is only the past, as it is being told by the self that exists right now, and yourself right now is not telling anything yet. This is why people in your phase often report that they do not know who they were. They are not amnesiac. They remember the facts. They simply cannot locate themselves inside the facts anymore. The girl in the photograph is recognizable, but no longer feels continuous with the person looking at the photograph. The decisions made at 25 no longer feel like decisions you made. They feel like decisions made by someone whose reasoning you can reconstruct but no longer share. This is not dissociation in the clinical sense. This is the interregnum applied to autobiography. The old narrator has stepped down. The new narrator has not yet taken the chair. The story sits, for now, untold. I want to say something gentle here, because this severity is the one that frightens people most, and the fright itself can extend the phase unnecessarily. You are not losing your memory. You are not losing yourself. You are losing the ownership of a particular telling. The telling will return. It will return in a different voice, with different emphases, and with a different sense of which events were central. Some events that once seemed defining will feel peripheral. Some events that once seemed peripheral will reveal themselves as having been the actual hinges. This is not revisionism. This is the natural consequence of the structure that organizes memory being rebuilt by the self below the level of conscious supervision. Until then, when people ask you to tell them about yourself, you will find that you do not know what to say. The answers that used to come automatically no longer feel honest. New answers have not formed. The phase teaches a kind of conversational economy. You say less because less is true. Most people will read this as withdrawal. Some will read it as healing. A few, the ones who have been in this phase themselves, it will recognize what it is and not press you for more. The third severity is the strangeness of love. I will be careful here, because this region is the one where the popular framework does the most damage. The framework promises that when you stop carrying everyone, your relationships will sort themselves into the ones that are reciprocal and the ones that are not, and you will be surrounded eventually by the reciprocal ones, and this will feel like love finally arriving in the form you deserved. That promise is partly true and mostly misleading. What actually happens in this phase is that your capacity for the kind of love you used to give has been temporarily withdrawn, not permanently, temporarily, but during the withdrawal, you will not be able to perform the warmth that used to be automatic, and the people around you, including the ones who are reciprocal, including the ones who deserve your love, will feel the difference. Some of them will be hurt by it. Some of them will adjust, a few will leave. The ones who stay will not be staying because they are receiving from you what they used to receive. They will be staying because something in them recognizes what is happening to you and is willing to wait. These are not necessarily the people you would have predicted. The phase, among its other functions, reveals which of your relationships were sustained by your output and which were sustained by something quieter that does not depend on output. You will be surprised by some of the results. You will grieve some of them. You will, eventually, be grateful for the ones that remain, though the gratitude will not feel like the warm gratitude you remember. It will feel like the recognition of something that did not need to be earned. I want you to understand that the temporary withdrawal of your old loving capacity is not a sign that you have become cold. It is a sign that the structure through which you used to love has been dismantled along with the structure through which you used to carry. They were the same structure. You did not know this, because the love and the carrying had been fused since childhood, and you had no way of separating them. The dismantling has separated them. What is forming slowly in the vessel is a capacity to love that does not require carrying as its proof. That capacity has not finished forming. While it is forming, you will feel cold to yourself. You will worry that you have damaged something. You have not damaged anything. You have unfused something that needed to be unfused, and the unfusion takes time to settle into a new configuration. There is a passage in the later parts of Mysterium Coniunctionis, Jung's last major work, the one he completed in his 80s, the one almost no one finishes reading, where he describes the coniunctio, the union, as something that becomes possible only after a thorough separation has been accomplished. He is writing about alchemy. He is also writing about the human psyche. He is also, though he does not say so directly, writing about love. The point he is making across hundreds of pages is that genuine union is not the absence of separation. It is what becomes possible because separation has been completed. The lovers who have never separated cannot truly meet. They are fused. Fusion is not union. Fusion is the prevention of union by means of premature contact. What you are doing in this phase is completing the separation. You are unfusing from the family weather. You are unfusing from the imagined future. You are unfusing from the narrative ownership of your own past. You are unfusing from the old loving capacity that required you to carry. None of this is romantic. All of this is necessary if the union that comes next, and there is a union that comes next, though it does not look like the unions promised by the popular framework, is going to be the real one. The vessel is sealed. The pressure is real. The combining is occurring at a temperature you cannot lower and cannot raise. Your work, again, is not to interfere. Your work is to know what is happening to you with enough precision that you do not abandon the process out of misunderstanding. I want to give you one more image before this part closes, because images in this phase do more work than concepts. The image is from the alchemical illustrations Jung studied so carefully, the ones in the Rosarium Philosophorum, the series of plates that depict the stages of the great work. In one of the plates, the one that comes after the dissolution and before the new conjunction, there is a figure lying in a tomb and a small bird, traditionally interpreted as the soul, is shown leaving the body and rising above it. The figure in the tomb is not dead. The figure in the tomb is in the state the alchemists called putrefactio, the necessary decay that precedes the new form. The bird is not abandoning the body. The bird is what is being released from the old structure in order to participate in the formation of the new one. You are the figure in the tomb. The carrying self has been laid down. The decay is proceeding as it must. And something small, something that does not yet have a clear name, something that the old structure could not contain, has been released. It is above you now. It is waiting for the next stage to be ready to receive it. When the new structure forms, the released thing will re-enter, and what comes out of the tomb will not be a resurrection of the old self. It will be a self that contains the old self's experiences, but is no longer organized by them. That is what is happening to you. That is what the popular framework cannot say. Because the popular framework needs the story to end with the leaving, the actual story continues from there, into the tomb, into the decay, into the small back room with the autumn light, into the sealed vessel, into the patient unfusion of what was fused too early. The carrying self has been laid down, the bird has been released, the structure that will receive the bird again has not yet been built. This is the phase. This is where you are. This is what you are inside. I want to bring this lecture to its closing movement, and I want to do so without offering you the consolation the popular framework would offer here. The popular framework, at this point in the arc, would tell you that everything will be fine, that what you are inside is temporary, that a beautiful new self is on its way, and you must simply trust the process. I will not say those things to you, because none of them are precisely true, and you have spent enough of your life accepting things that were almost true in exchange for the comfort they provided. That exchange is part of what you stopped doing when you stopped carrying everyone. I will not reintroduce it now in a different form. Here is what is actually true. The phase you are inside will not resolve itself on the timeline you would prefer. It will take longer than the books suggest. The first months will feel the worst. There will be a middle period, and I cannot tell you exactly when it will begin, because it begins differently for each person, during which the worst of the disorientation will quiet, and you will mistake the quieting for completion. You will think the phase has ended. You will begin to make decisions based on this assumption. Most of those decisions will be premature. The quieting is not completion. The quieting is the vessel cooling slightly so that the next stage of the combining can occur. You will know completion when it arrives, because completion does not announce itself as completion. It announces itself as the absence of the question that has been organizing your interior for months. Who am I now? What am I for? Where is the self that was supposed to arrive will simply, one day, no longer be present, not answered, not resolved, absent. You will notice its absence some days after it has gone. You will not be able to locate when, precisely, it stopped asking itself, That is how this phase ends, not with arrival, with the cessation of the question. Until then, there is a particular kind of attention I want to recommend to you, and I am using the word recommend with deliberate weight, because this is not advice in the ordinary sense. It is the only thing this phase actually responds to. The attention is this: notice what you are doing without supervising what you are doing. Notice what you reach for in the morning, what you no longer reach for, what tone of voice you use when you answer the phone, which conversations leave you tired and which do not, which rooms in your house you find yourself sitting in for longer than you used to, which rooms you have stopped entering. Do not interpret any of this, do not assign meaning, do not make decisions based on the noticing. Simply notice. The self, which is doing the work that you cannot do consciously, communicates its progress through these small alterations of behavior, and the noticing is the only way to receive the communication. The communication is not asking you to do anything. The communication is informing you that the work is proceeding. That is all. There was a man I worked with for several years, I will not say where, because the details are not relevant, who entered this phase at 51, after a long marriage had ended, and after he had simultaneously, in the same season, stepped back from a professional role that had defined him for 2 decades. He came to me in considerable distress, not because he regretted either decision, but because he could not locate himself inside his own days. He described his life as a house in which he was a guest. The phrase struck me, and I asked him to stay with it. He stayed with it for almost 2 years. During those years, he made no large decisions. He kept the small structure of his days. He walked the same routes. He read what he had always read. He did not, as many people in his position do, attempt to construct a new identity through travel or new relationships or geographic relocation. He waited. In the 3rd year, he came to me with a dream I want to give you now, because it described the completion of the phase with a precision I have rarely encountered in dream material. He dreamed he was standing in a long corridor. There were 2 doors. One was behind him, slightly ajar, and through it he could see the rooms of a house. He recognized the house of his former life, intact, furnished, lit by lamps. The other door was in front of him, closed. He did not know what was behind it. In the dream, he understood that he had been standing in this corridor for a very long time, longer than he could measure, and that the corridor itself had been his entire experience for that duration. He had assumed, while standing there, that he was supposed to choose between the 2 doors. The dream's revelation, when it came, was simple and complete. He was not supposed to choose. The corridor was not a place of choosing. The corridor was a place of waiting until the door in front of him opened on its own. And in the dream, as he stood there understanding this, the door in front of him began to open, not all the way, only enough to admit a thin line of light along its edge. He woke before the door opened fully. He told me, when he described the dream, that he had woken not with frustration at the incompleteness, but with a strange and unfamiliar relief. He had understood in the dream that the opening was not his work. His work had been the waiting. The waiting had been sufficient. He emerged from the phase, by his own account, within the following season, not because the dream had completed the work. The dream had reported that the work was nearly complete. The emergence itself happened in the way I described earlier, not as an arrival, but as the cessation of the question. He noticed one afternoon that he had not asked himself who he was for several weeks. He noticed it without alarm. The asking had simply ceased. What had replaced it was not an answer. What had replaced it was the capacity to live without the question being necessary. This is what waits for you, not an answer. The capacity to live without the question being necessary. I want to name something about the people you stopped carrying, because we have circled this all the way through and I do not want to leave it unfinished. They will, some of them, attempt re-entry into your life. The attempts will come at various points across the phase. Some will come early, while you are still raw, and these will be the easiest to refuse, because the rawness will refuse them for you. Some will come later, in the middle period, when the quieting has begun, and these will be more dangerous, because you will feel, briefly, that you have the bandwidth to carry again, and the carrying will offer itself as a kind of return to recognizable selfhood. Refuse it, not with anger, with a simple recognition that the bandwidth you feel is not bandwidth for carrying, it is bandwidth for the work that is still proceeding inside you. And any carrying you take on in this period will be drawn from the budget the work requires. The people who attempt re-entry are not necessarily acting in bad faith. Most of them are not. Most of them are simply experiencing your absence as a wound, and they are attempting, in the way humans attempt these things, to close the wound by restoring the configuration that produced their original comfort. They are not asking you to carry them maliciously. They are asking you to carry them because that is the only relational structure they have ever had with you. They do not know another one. You do not yet have another one to offer. The phase has not finished producing the configuration in which you could relate to them differently. If they are people you wish to remain in your life, the answer is not to re-enter the old structure. The answer is to wait until the phase has completed enough that a new structure can be offered. The new structure may or may not be one they can accept. Some of them will be able to accept it. Some will not. You cannot know in advance. You can only know that offering the old structure now, in order to preserve the relationship through the phase, will preserve nothing. It will simply restart the cycle that brought you into the phase in the first place. This is what Jung was naming in his late work, when he spoke about the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold opposites without collapsing them into one another. You are being asked, in this phase, to hold the opposition between your love for these people and your inability to love them in the old way. The popular framework wants you to collapse this opposition immediately, either by deciding that you no longer love them, which simplifies things, or by deciding that loving them means returning to the carrying, which also simplifies things. The phase does not allow either simplification. The phase requires that you hold both the love and the incapacity without resolving them. The resolution if it comes, will come from a level of the psyche that the conscious ego cannot access. It will arrive as a third thing, neither the love by carrying nor the absence of love, that has no name in the current vocabulary because it has not yet been common enough to be named. What has been named here is what you have been living, the carrying self that you laid down, the vessel that sealed around you afterward, the interregnum that has no diagnostic code and no popular framework, the empty rooms with their autumn light, the figure in the tomb and the released bird, the corridor with its two doors and the patience the corridor requires. None of this was unknown before you arrived in it. Jung had walked through it. The alchemists had walked through it. Patients of his, whose names history did not preserve, had walked through it. You are not the first person to be inside this phase. You are simply the first person to be inside it in your particular life, with your particular history, in the particular configuration of details that makes your version of it irreducible. The loneliness you feel, then, is not unique. It is yours, but it is not unique. Other people have stood in the corridor. Other people have walked through the unfurnished rooms. Other people have noticed, eventually, that the question had stopped asking itself. They do not, most of them, write about it. There is a quality to having been through this phase that produces a reluctance to perform it for an audience. The people who have completed it tend to recognize each other quietly, in small ways, and to leave each other alone about it. You will, in time, recognize some of them. You will not need to discuss it with them. Recognition will be sufficient. I want to close with one more thing, and I want to say it as plainly as I can. You stopped carrying everyone. You are now in the phase that follows. The phase has a shape, a duration, a set of severities, and a completion that does not look like the completion you were taught to expect. Nothing about the phase is your failure. Nothing about the loneliness is evidence that you should reverse the decision. The reversal would be a deeper failure than the loneliness, because the reversal would interrupt the formation of the self that the loneliness is making space for. The self that is forming is not a better version of the carrying self. It is a different self entirely. It will not announce itself. It will not arrive with the kind of clarity the popular framework promised. It will simply, at some point you cannot predict, to begin to be the one answering your questions, making your small decisions, walking into your rooms. You will recognize it not because it resembles anyone you have been before, but because it does not require recognition. It will be present without performing presence. This is the marker. This is how you will know the phase has completed, not when you feel whole, when you no longer require the feeling of wholeness in order to be present in your own life. Until then, the work is the waiting, and the waiting is not nothing, and the corridor is not a punishment, and the loneliness is not an error. The carrying has ended, the vessel has sealed, the phase is proceeding without your supervision. You are no longer the one they could use. The configuration that required you cannot return.